think we can start now. Thank you everyone for joining us for this session today. Let me introduce Dr. Tsuyoshi Brauri. She managed the Global People Research and Analytics at McGraw-Hill, where she leads the research leveraging employee data across 45 countries to generate data-driven insights for policy decisions impacting organizational effectiveness, employee engagement, inclusion, culture, and talent. Tsuyoshi has interdisciplinary background in Masters in Mechanical Engineering and Applied Statistics, and her PhD in Engineering Education. Tsuyoshi is a maker of these itineraries who, like statistics, loves dogs, practices feminism, dabbles in writings, and enjoys tea and long conversation. She is happy to connect with attendees over LinkedIn and in her scheduled virtual meetup right after this session. Thank you, Doctor, for joining us today. The presentation is yours.
Thank you, Ruben. Good afternoon, DataCon LA. I appreciate all of you who are joining in on your Sunday from different parts of the globe. I'm located in East Coast, USA, and I'm absolutely excited to spend the next 40 minutes talking about a topic that I'm incredibly passionate about, people analytics. So with that, welcome to my session on people analytics and data science. I will begin by introducing myself. I am Dr. Tsuyoshi Brauri, and I lead Global People Research and Analytics at McGraw-Hill. You may have heard of McGraw-Hill. It is a global leader in publishing and learning sciences and has presence in over 40 countries across the globe. My work at McGraw-Hill leverages data from the employees at our organization to better the employee experience, as well as inform data-driven decision-making. So my goal over the next couple of minutes is to get you thinking about people analytics. This session is at a beginner level, and it is assumed that all those attending have no prior knowledge in people research. Although if you have some knowledge, that's great, and I'm looking forward to questions. We do assume that we all here have a basic understanding of data sciences. We will begin with first describing people analytics, then moving on to understanding the need for inclusive and ethical context-driven data-specific best practices for people analytics. Finally, we will explore AI and ML application to people analytics problems. So essentially, today we will be answering three main questions. First, what is people analytics? Second, why is it important to be inclusive and context-driven in the people analytics space? And third, how can everyone best use AI and ML in data science in people analytics? As much as I'd like for this talk to be interactive, I know that the session is only 40 minutes, including time for Q&A. We might not get to all the questions in the session, although I do encourage you to type those in the chat or fill out the session Q&A. I have created a virtual meetup to begin as soon as the session ends, so feel free to hop in on that session and we can chat more about people analytics, and you can ask me any additional questions you may have that we may not get to here. So with that, let's answer our first question. What is people analytics? Well, since the time that people have had jobs, there has been some kind of people analytics, if you think about it. In fact, you may even have heard of people analytics being used in some form or the other at your organization or in your teams or at your university. Chances are that you may have heard of some or the other version of the name people analytics. So people analytics, talent analytics, workforce analytics, worker analytics, HR analytics, these are all very similar terms. And although there may be some nuanced differences or variations in the focus of each term. Essentially, all of them are interested in using data to understand how employees are engaged, how effective they are, and how can the employee experience be bettered. So back in 2016, Huvel and Bondaruk described people analytics as a systematic identification and quantification of the people drivers of business outcomes. So they emphasized on quantification, and we're thinking in mathematical terms now when we're thinking of the people at an organization. A more updated definition that does not limit people analytics to quantification alone is by Gall, Jensen, and Stein, where they broadly define people analytics as a data-driven approach to managing people at work. So, of course, if we understand people analytics to be data-driven, our next question logically becomes, what are the types of people analytics data, right? Well, if we think of people analytics data, we can think of data as being demographic. So for example, looking at things like gender, race, ethnicity, age, caste, region, etc., all attributes of an employee. Data can also be engagement related. So think of productivity, for example, or employee participation in a certain program. Finally, people analytics data can also be interaction related. So think of understanding workers not only as independent units or entities, but looking at how they interact with their peers, their managers, their teams, the organization as a whole, even their customers or their environment that they're in. So now that we have the data, what can the tasks be? What are some typical people analytics tasks? Well, broadly, people analytics tasks can be descriptive. So think of, for example, counting the numbers. That is a typically descriptive task. It can also be predictive, which is exactly as it sounds, the task of estimating or predicting an outcome or a response. And finally, it can be diagnostic. So think of it in terms of thinking of success or failure of outcomes and trying to really understand why something worked or why it didn't. So it's descriptive, predictive, and diagnostic. So now that we have our data and we have some idea of the different tasks that can be conducted, let's look at some examples. So if we look at, for example, demographic related data and using predictive tasks on this demographic related data set, one example could be, at the current rate, how many years will it take for the senior leadership at a given organization to comprise at least 70% diversity? So you can see from this statement or from this research question that we're trying to really predict how long it will take. We're trying to predict time or years or months that it will take for senior leadership at an organization to come up to a given metric. This can be 70%, 60%, 30%, whatever metric we're aiming for. Another example is when we're looking at engagement related data and we're looking at a task which is more descriptive. So we've moved away from predictive and now we're just looking to define or describe the data set. So an example of this could be, how many sales teams, notice I ask how many, so that in itself is a descriptive task. How many sales team reached their targets in the last quarter and how many were impacted over 25% due to the pandemic? So over here, you can see that again, we have a metric. We are comparing the performance, or we are comparing targets, or ability of an employee or sales team to reach a target to a metric. We're saying over 25%. And we're really trying to describe what has happened and what is going on within a given team or a set of teams or within a region or a country, for example. So this is an example of a more descriptive related task, which is on engagement related data. Now, often in people analytics processes or at organizations, several data types and tasks intersect to give us an idea about a given phenomena or a context. So it's not just, for example, looking at one task or looking at one type of data. It's really looking at interactions of different types of data set and using all of those together to get an insight to drive decision making, if that makes sense. Okay, so moving on. Let's look at the employee experience, right? So if you're an employee, or if you know employees, you probably identify some of the steps in this cycle. So employees typically start with, applying for a job. So that is the attraction phase. Then they are specifically recruited for the job or task. Then they're onboarded if they are thought to be qualified enough for the job, thought to be a good fit for the team. They bring value to an organization. They're onboarded to the organization, right? Then once the employee is in the company, in the organization, or in the team, we think of the employee's engagement. So how well did an employee work on a given task? How engaged is an employee? How effective is an employee? How productive is an employee? All of these metrics and questions come under engagement. Other examples could be, has the employee participated in learning and development? Is the employee building on their skill gap, for example? Those kind of things. So all within engagement. Now, the employee is probably not in the same role or same capacity within the organization for a long time, right? People do get promoted. So that is the next step of the employee life cycle, getting a promotion. So factors that go into here are who is getting promoted, who isn't getting promoted, why is someone getting promoted faster, at what rate people are getting promoted, those kind of things. So the employee is engaged, the employee is getting promoted. What about retention? And retention is essentially, we typically look at retention in terms of voluntary as well as involuntary terminations. And what that means is an employee interested in continuing with the company, or are they applying to different companies, for example? Are effective employees, are we doing a good job at retaining or making sure that our organization is inclusive enough to retain a diverse set of employees? So that is essentially the focus of retention. And finally, when an employee decides to separate from the organization and they leave the organization and become external to the organization. And of course, all separations, it necessarily does not mean that the employee cannot join back, right? So it's the cycle, because if that person is truly talented and is working on a given skill set that is important to the organization will try its best to attract the employee again and try to bring them back in to the team or into the organization. So this is the employee experience or the employee life cycle. So where does people analytics fit in? Let's look at the recruiting step, right? So we have recruiting here right below attraction. So this is the step where we are trying to recruit, we are trying to hire an employee and see if, which teams require a new employee, which team has a demand for a new employee, those kind of things. Now, people analytics can help drive the data as we hire the best candidates for roles within our organization. So essentially, we can answer questions like, how long does it take to hire for a role? How diverse is our applicant slate? Is there unconscious bias in who we hire? Is there bias in how we hire? So for example, people analytics can help you answer questions like, how long does it take to hire for a role, or even be predictive and take it up a notch and tell us how much time to anticipate and associate costs to expect if you're looking to fill a given position. So these are some of the things that people analytics can help with in the recruiting phase of the employee life cycle. Now, Steve Levy from Indeed remarked that people analytics in the recruiting phase, he was talking about recruitment, and he says that people analytics are needed to take massive amounts of data being generated before, during, and after the recruiting process and turn it into actionable information. And that's exactly what people analytics contributes to this part of the employee life cycle. So now that we have a general idea of what people analytics is, and we have an idea of what questions people analytics can ask, or what tasks can be performed and what data sets we look at, let's move on to our second question, and that is, why is it important to be inclusive and data-driven, context-driven, my apologies, context-driven when looking at people analytics problems? Laszlo Bock, during his time as Senior Vice President of People Operations at Google, remarked, "Don't trust your gut." He said, "Use data to predict and shape the future." And yes, that's a great statement to make. But at the same time, using data and using analytical methods, we see there is a lot of advancement in AI and ML, which have really allowed us to extend the boundaries and capabilities of analytics, or really how we look at the data. So of course, we're not relying on our gut anymore, possibly, but we are also probably over-relying on certain AI or ML capacities or capabilities. Now, there's a widespread belief that algorithmic intelligence can replace human intervention. Through this talk, one of my main focuses is that algorithmic intelligence can augment human intervention. And this is true especially for the HR or the human resources space, which is essentially where people analytics is situated, right? We're dealing with humans, we're dealing with the employees, we're right at the HR role within the organization. We're using data science, we're using analytics to solve within this discipline. And it goes without saying that when we employ AI or ML in systems that have decision-making, in systems that affect humans and individuals and employees and teams, and when we use algorithms to solve for those problems and challenges, we need to understand that algorithms have bias. And this shouldn't be new to anyone who's attending this conference, of course. And we've had a lot of talks and sessions talking about algorithmic bias. I do want to highlight some books that I think are excellent resources on the topic. There are several blogs as well. There are several YouTube videos, lot of resources out there, podcasts talking about bias, but I wanted to highlight these few books, especially Noble's Algorithms of Oppression. And I highlight this particular one because Dr. Noble was one of our keynote speakers at the conference, I believe on Friday. So really try to pick up this book if you're interested in knowing more about algorithmic bias and really how search engines reinforce racism. She does a brilliant job explaining algorithms of oppression and talking about bias that is built in and into search engines like Google. In people analytics, bias is dangerous. And this goes without saying. Of course, bias is dangerous in any other field. But in people analytics, bias, among other things, can lead to discrimination, for example. And it can affect employees, it can affect their engagement, and it can have all the outcomes that are absolutely opposite of what our desired outcomes are. So in people analytics, bias is exceptionally dangerous. So let's look at this study. And this was research published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER, in 2003 that looked at racial discrimination in the labor market. And what they did essentially was that they submitted resumes with African-American sounding and white sounding names as responses to recruitment ads in newspapers. What they saw was, and obviously the resumes were fictional, what they saw was that white names or white sounding names received 50% more callbacks for interviews. And this is an example of how bias comes into recruiting, how bias, human bias, comes into the employee life cycle. This was a study conducted in 2003. We are almost 2 decades past this point. But imagine now perpetuating this bias through algorithms. We're thinking of using algorithms to solve for bias in hiring. We are trying to think of algorithms as being objective. But are algorithms truly objective? What is going on in algorithms and how can they perpetuate those biases? So these are 2 examples. The first is Amazon's machine learning tool for recruiting, and this is from 2018, where they scrapped the AI recruiting tool because it definitively showed that there was bias against hiring women within the organization. So essentially what was happening was that the algorithm was rejecting women at a higher rate than it was rejecting men. And this was especially true for STEM-related positions like software development engineer, software engineer, those kind of positions in STEM and engineering, which are typically more male-dominated, right? So why was the algorithm doing that? Why was the recruiting engine doing that? It was doing that because it had data, it had historic data from 10 years that was looking at resumes and looking at who was a good fit for the organization. Now, the problem with that was that across the 10-year span, there were more men who were more ideal for the positions. And as a result, the data set had inherent bias programmed into it, which was obviously leading to an outcome which was biased and discriminative against women. More recently, there is an app called HireVue, and this is from a post on HireVue, which basically takes videos of people responding to job interviews or video interviews and really looks at those videos. The algorithm essentially looks at those videos and then essentially classifies the interviewee into whether or not the person is a good fit for the position. Now, what is happening in this is that analyzing a human being or analyzing an individual or an applicant in this manner could really end up penalizing non-native speakers. Forget non-native speakers. Even those who are maybe introverted, who are nervous interviewees, or anyone who doesn't really fit or look or speak like a stereotype of a good or effective recruit is essentially rejected by the algorithm. So thinking about recruiting and thinking about AI is great. It's awesome that we are making huge strides towards using AI and using data science and machine learning in different people analytics applications. But we need to err on the side of caution and make sure that we are being conscious and intentional about our choices of the algorithms that we're using and the methods that we're using and the results or the inferences that we're drawing from the results of the AI systems. So now we come to our third and last part. We're wrapping up and we're thinking about, so we've discussed what is people analytics. We've also discussed some examples of what makes up people analytics data and how to understand or analyze that data. We've also looked at bias and how bias can creep into people analytics. So now we are going to really brainstorm ideas on how to best use machine learning or AI in people analytics. And of course, these set of recommendations are few, and you're encouraged to add more to these and contribute to the conversation that we'll have right after this presentation is over. So let's look again at the employee life cycle. So we're familiar with all the steps of the cycle. And now, when we think about people analytics and using people analytics within any of these or all of these phases of the employee life cycle, we first need to understand, does the problem merit an AI solution? So that is one of the first things we need to ask ourselves. We have a lot of data and we are trying to solve for a problem, for example, but does the problem or the solution to the problem need to be solved by AI? Do we need artificial intelligence? Do we need machine learning? Do we need data science as part of the process? So that is the first question to ask. The second is, do you have enough data? And more importantly, is the data that you're capturing the desired variables? So are your target variables or is your target data really valid? Is it capturing the things that you want to capture rather than capturing everything which is not relevant or decreases data quality, for example? Finally, we want to look at, is your team diverse? And are your solutions explainable? So we started with, really understanding what our problem was, and we decided that we wanted to use an AI solution. We saw that we have enough data, and we saw that our data is indeed capturing the variables that we're interested in capturing. So what we're interested in this step is really looking at the solution, looking at the methods, looking at all the different decision making that goes into the entire process, and really think about, okay, is my solution applicable? What inferences am I going to draw from this? And how is it going to affect the employees as I make decisions which are driven by data? So is it truly being driven by data, or are we trying to say that it's driven by data but not really doing so? And there is this quote by Ronald Coase, and who is a Nobel laureate in economics, and he talks about how if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. And I really like this quote. I appreciate it because it really highlights how we can use data science and we can manipulate data, we can manipulate methods, especially if we're not conscious and if we're not intentional about identifying or acknowledging our biases and keeping it away from the decision making, or really, rather than keeping it away, acknowledging it and making it or factoring the biases in and making sure that we're making up for them in the decision making process. And we're not attributing everything to the data. We're not saying that, oh, the data says this and that's why we're doing it, because data can go either way. We can essentially make data confess to anything if we torture it long enough. So with that, I come to the final slide of my presentation. And if there is one takeaway that I'd like for you all to take from this presentation, it is that think of people analytics as giving the employees within your organization voice, choice, and care. And what does that mean? What that means is essentially that the data that you collect to drive decisions for employees is truly representative of the employees that are going to be affected by it. So making sure that every voice is heard. And you can do this by collecting diverse sets of data, making sure that your data collection methods are appropriate, but also collecting data that is mixed. So you don't have to really stick to, say, quantifying a given variable. You can collect qualitative data, you can do sentiment analysis, you can really use and make sure that all employees' voice is factored into your decision making. Second is that there is choice, and choice essentially also is related to transparency, or really thinking about how transparent your findings are. Are you involving the people or employees within your organization in the decision making? How transparent are you being with how the data was collected? Was it collected ethically? Are you making sure that you're not, spying on your employees, for example? So making sure that your employees are acknowledged really as important stakeholders, and making sure that they know that they have choice in this entire process. So they have that sense of autonomy in the decision making as well. And finally, care. I think essentially people analytics boils down to care. The care component being, how much do you value your employees at your organization? How well do you think you know your employees at an organization? Especially given the pandemic, for example, you may be tempted in, surveying your employees every day, every week. But really, the core of it, you want to make sure that you're not burdening the employee with collecting excess data, but you're really using the data that you have collected, even if it's limited, to drive for changes that really bring about or show that you care for your employees. Because at the end of the day, care is what will drive effectiveness amongst your employees or your teams and overall at your organization. So really thinking of people analytics as voice, choice, and care is the one big takeaway that I would indulge in from this talk or session. As we wrap up, let's really reflect. Are you able to describe people analytics? Maybe a little, maybe you're still confused and we can get to question and answering right after this. Do you understand the need for inclusive and ethical context-driven best practices? So can you think of examples wherein you would use AI for a people analytics problem, but then also brainstorm why there may be ethical components to that question and how you can be more inclusive as you think about data methods, data collection, drawing inferences, even presenting or communicating the results, for example, being more transparent in the process. Finally, are you able to explore applications of AI and ML to people analytics? So having described and understood the need for inclusive and ethical people analytics, are you then able to think of challenges that you would solve for? Maybe it's pay equity, maybe looking at the pay gap, maybe it's looking for how you can better serve or better help employees currently who may be remote due to the pandemic. Maybe it's questions about really supporting all employees. And finally, that brings us to the end of the presentation, and happy to answer any questions you may have. And feel free to connect with me over Twitter, on LinkedIn, and or visit my website. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tsuyoshi. We have, I think we have time, 3 minutes left for a quick question. We have 3 on the Q&A section. This one is how people analytics is different from HR analytics and data analytics.
Right. Well, I think people analytics, I've described people analytics, and it's more broad. It deals with all employees within the organization. So it could also look at maybe, for example, within the sales team, what is driving engagement, what is driving productivity, those kind of things. And that is different from data analytics because data analytics is broader, right? It can refer to analytics on any kind of data. People analytics is more specific. It is using analytics, using data science for people, for employees within an organization or a team. So it's more specific. And I think the other one was HR analytics. HR analytics looks at specific HR concerns. So it could look at learning and development, it could look at recruiting. So it is more HR focused, whereas people analytics can be really broad. So you can think of data analytics as an umbrella term, and then people analytics being a little broader, and then HR analytics being a subset of people analytics, if that makes sense.
Okay, the next one is, could people analytics be applied to a university application process as well to monitor or reduce the admission bias?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I got into the people analytics space because I was looking at effectiveness of a summer STEM program for underrepresented minority children. And part of the program was we wanted to recruit more diverse teachers or instructors for the program. So we do look at, so people analytics is really broad. And although it's probably not called that within universities or academic contexts, it's essentially the same thing we are looking at processes, we are looking at different phases of an individual joining a team, being part of a team, and then graduating or terminating from a team. So essentially, if you think about a student's life cycle within the university as similar to an employee's life cycle within an organization, then people analytics can, of course, and obviously be used within universities and should be and are being used at several universities. So thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. I think it's time. Thank you everyone for joining us at this session.
Thank you. And
enjoy the rest of the meeting.
You can join that if you have more questions.
Okay, thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.